Hello, and welcome back to AMH 2020 American History since 1877. This week, we're covering Chapter 27, the 60s, kind of. Like we talked about last week, I combined some of the material from the 1950s and the 1960s just so that it was together thematically. As a result, this lecture is a little bit longer than most, so I highly recommend taking breaks as you need them. And I've also split the video up so you can watch it in chunks. So we will be covering the lecture in three parts. Part one is like the typical chapter review. Part two is there's a lot of Supreme Court cases and landmark cases and case law that takes place this chapter. So we'll be going over those. And then the last part will be covering the civil rights movement. There is, of course, overlap between the three. I've tried not to be too repetitive, but if you're noticing that I'm referencing like the same legislation or the same people multiple times, it's because all of this is kind of happening at the same time. And I've just tried to segment it by topic or theme and a little bit by chronologically, just in the hopes to make it a little bit more digestible and easier to understand since it is a lot of information. So definitely be ready to take notes during this. I would actually recommend both taking notes on content and timestamps as well. But if you ever have any questions, feel free, go ahead and just shoot me an email and let's get into it. So we'll be starting off with just kind of a chapter overview so I can explain some concepts in more detail and kind of go over things and hopefully make the overall content for this week a little bit easier to understand. So we're kind of starting off, since it's the 60s, with the 1960 election. And it is the election of John F. Kennedy versus Richard Nixon. It's really important to understand that both these elections, these presidencies, as well as this actual election, is taking a place against the backdrop of the Cold War, right? So we ended World War II last week in the 1950s. We talked about the Cold War and the role that that played. This is continuing into the 1960s. Just before the 1960 election, the United States begins to experience the worst recession that it's had since the Great Depression. It is by no means as bad as the Great Depression was, but it is definitely like a cause for concern, especially for people who have lived through the Great Depression. And it's also interesting to note that the 1960 election is the first time both candidates had been born in the 20th century. And that's John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. They're both fairly young. John F. Kennedy, he ends up winning the election, spoiler alert. But he goes on to become the youngest president ever elected to the United States. But Richard Nixon was only a couple of years older than Kennedy at the time of this election. So either or, they would have been the youngest or one of the youngest. So that's just some things to keep in mind. The image on the bottom of the screen is some of the campaign buttons. I truly believe that the 1960s, 1970s, and even going into the 1980s a little bit have some of the best presidential like campaign buttons ever. They're really fun. Some of them are kind of funny, and some of them are kind of just like your standard Kennedy for president. But I just wanted to include them because I think they're neat. Richard Nixon is the sitting vice president at the time of the 1960 presidential election. And he has a lot of experience. He's been a politician for a number of years by now. For example, he's the current vice president, and he kind of really runs his campaign on these concepts, right? And sort of that, don't you want to continue the prosperity of the Eisenhower era, which makes sense since Nixon was Eisenhower's vice president. And he has way more political experience in both domestic and foreign affairs than his opponent, who would be John F. Kennedy. He his running mate is Henry Cabot Lodge from Massachusetts, and another kind of prong, I guess, of his campaign is that he wants to reduce the amount of government spending. It had been pretty high since the Great Depression. He has come up in a couple of presidential elections, if you remember from last week. Um, and he again is kind of recommending or taking the position to reduce how much the federal government is spending. This is in sharp contrast to John F. Kennedy, who wants to continue to use federal programs and the relative strength of the economy in order to address poverty that's taking place, or that's happening at this point in time. Um, he's from Massachusetts. He'd been a US Senator at the time of running for president. He chooses Lyndon B. Johnson from Texas as his running mate. And he also ends up sort of taking on civil rights as part of his campaign. Just a few weeks before the election, Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested while participating in a protest in Atlanta, Georgia. And although it was politically risky for Kennedy, he ended up calling Coretta Scott King in order to express his concern. And he called, or he had his brother, Robert Kennedy, call a judge and help to secure the release of JFK, of Martin Luther King. And that intervention and that kind of um, public support of Martin Luther King and um, the civil rights movement helped to gain support amongst Black voters for John F. Kennedy. Um, One of the big things to note about Kennedy's presidency, or about his campaign, that is to say, he faced a lot of criticism, especially in the primaries, but also in the main election due to his Catholic faith. There had never been a non Protestant president prior to Kennedy. In the 1920s, there was a candidate who was also Catholic who ran for president, and he did not get the nomination. It is not wholly due because he was Catholic, but that definitely played a role. Kennedy also had to sort of combat the people who were uncomfortable with this or who critiqued him for this. John F. Kennedy goes on to win the 1960 election. But one of the other really interesting parts about the 1960 election is that it has the first televised presidential debate. I think we kind of take these for granted in the present day. It's tradition at this point. Um, Typically, there's a presidential debate. Um, that's aired live on national television. But prior to 1960, that didn't happen. And so this is the very first time. And the reason that wasn't really a thing that happened was in large part because not that many Americans had televisions. Um, we've kind of referenced this before about like the increasing amount of electricity or access to electricity, I should say, and appliances coming into the American homes over the course of the last couple of decades, right, from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. Well, in 1950, only about 11% of Americans had televisions, but by the time of the 1960 election, about 88% of Americans had televisions. And so this is, again, a really notable debate, right? Because it's the first presidential debate, but it's also, people attribute this debate to one of the reasons why Nixon lost. And that's because President Kennedy, or at this time, he's not president, Senator Kennedy, um, presented himself so well on national television. He had met with the producer to discuss the design of the set and placement the day before. And Nixon, who did not come off nearly as well, had just come out of the hospital and did not have the opportunity to meet with the producer and discuss the set. He'd had a painful knee injury, And while Kennedy wore a blue suit and shirt to cut down on the glare, Nixon wore a gray suit. And even though it was broadcasted in black and white, it really made a difference in how people viewed Kennedy and Nixon. And in addition, because of the lighting, um, it and Nixon was like kind of sweating and he just looked flustered, and it just didn't go over well with voters. And so ultimately, John F. Kennedy wins one of the closest elections in, at that point, recent US history. But unfortunately, although he won the House or won the presidency, he did not have the necessary majorities in the House and Senate to pass sweeping changes. And I say unfortunately, really, because it was super unfortunate for him. And that when that happens to a president, it really makes it hard. They usually run on like a campaign of promises. And when they do not have like major majorities in the House and in the Senate, it's really hard to like push those through. This is a stark contrast to what we saw with FDR when he was elected. He also had like super majorities in both the House and the Senate, and so that's why he was able to pass through a lot of legislation really quickly. But when you don't have that, you can get pieces of your legislation taken out due to compromise, or it can just sort of get bogged down in the process. So that's the election of 1960. Kennedy's presidency um, is marked by a couple of really notable events. But before I kind of get into some of them, I will say that President Kennedy is one of the US's more well liked presidents. But even at the time, people were really taken with having such like a young, youthful presidential family in the White House. They really loved seeing pictures of the Kennedy children like running around the Oval Office. Um, and if you ever hear like references to like Jackie Kennedy's style, she was really a style icon at the time. So he was a pretty well liked president overall. Um, but we're going to talk about some of the other things as well. So first we have the Bay of Pigs. And so in 1959, Fidel Castro came to power in Cuba. And while the United States initially supported the new regime, President Dwight Eisenhower and members of his administration were very concerned. Since this is the middle of the Cold War, they had an issue with the new Cuban government instituting leftist economic policies centering on agrarian reform, land redistribution, and the nationalization of private enterprises, and a seemingly comfortable relationship with the Soviet Union. This privatization of property led to many U.S. citizens leaving the island, as well as Cuba's wealthy and middle class citizens leaving, and actually many resettling into Florida. So in 1961, the Eisenhower administration and then eventually Kennedy took over when he was inaugurated, authorized the CIA to plan an invasion of Cuba in an attempt to overthrow Castro. The CIA recruited Cuban exiles and trained with them in Guatemala. And then in April of 1961, this plan sort of went into action, and it was poorly managed and ultimately failed. It resulted in like the group that went to overthrow Cuba and getting captured, and they were held in captivity for 20 months. as the United States tried to negotiate a deal with Fidel Castro. And ultimately, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy was able to work with some pharmaceutical companies and baby food manufacturers in order to settle with Castro on $53 million worth of baby food and medicine in exchange for the prisoners. Kennedy took personal responsibility for the failed invasion. He issued a speech afterwards, and ultimately it ended up being kind of like a negative mark on his entire presidency. Following year, there is the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so what the Cuban Missile Crisis is in October 1962, an American U-2 spy plane photographed nuclear missile sites being built by the Soviet Union in Cuba, which was a huge cause of concern for the United States. And ultimately, Kennedy decided to place a naval blockade or like a ring of ships around Cuba in order to quarantine it, which meant like nothing could come in and nothing could come out, which obviously meant it was really hard to get imports and exports, which was obviously not super great for an island nation. But what we now know is that over the course of 13 days, there are conversations taking place between the United States, the USSR, and also Cuba, I'm pretty sure, in order to remove the nuclear missile sites from Cuba, as long as the United States remove our nuclear missile sites from Turkey. And it was a trade. This is not something that was known at the time, and in fact, these were classified documents for more than 25 years until they were finally released. And so that is how the 13-day Cuban Missile Crisis ended. So all of this really kind of marks a change in Cold War policies from President Eisenhower to President Kennedy. And so remember, we ended last week with how President Eisenhower prided himself on, how we ended last week with President Eisenhower's farewell speech warning against heavy defense spending. Well, that is in stark contrast to President Kennedy, who ends up supporting programs that result in a $6 billion rise in defense spending. There is a lot of speculation on, or there could be a lot of speculation on like why this takes place. And in fact, there's a number of books, articles, and probably dissertations written on it. But essentially, what he says about it is that our moral and physical strength begins at home, but it includes our military strength as well. We must arm to deter others from aggression. We have increased the previous defense budget, not in the expectation of war, but for the preservation of peace. And kind of a part of this preservation of peace that happens under John F. Kennedy is the new frontier. If you remember, weeks and weeks ago in chapter 19, we discussed the importance of the frontier in American history and culture. And I mentioned JFK's New Frontier, and I was like, oh, we'll talk about it later. Well, now it's later. And this is the New Frontier that I was referring to. And that is essentially the space race, or that is essentially the space race. So this idea of the frontier returns to sort of the American culture and idea in the forefront of people's minds, with the concept of conquering the new frontier. And what Kennedy says to the American people is, I am asking each of you to be new pioneers on that new frontier. My call is to the young in heart, regardless of age, to the stout in spirit, regardless of party. And so it is during the space race that it's a competition between the Soviet Union and the United States to develop technology in order to land on the moon. And in the prior to Kennedy taking office, the USSR is kind of winning the space race, and then JFK commits to the US landing a man on the moon by 1970. And over the course of the next decade, the United States has an American make it a space flight. And then we get John Glenn, who orbits Earth, is the first American to orbit Earth. And then in 1969, Apollo 11 lands on the moon. And so we're going to play this quick video. It's 2 minutes long, and it's of the Apollo 11 landing, in case you've never seen it.
Okay. At the foot of the ladder, the lamb footbeds are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches, although the surface appears to be very, very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder. Ground mass is very fine. And then a long one. Okay, I'm going to leave that 1 foot up there and both hands down about the 4th rung up. There you go. Okay, now I think I'll do the same. For those who haven't read the plaque, we'll read the plaque that's on the front landing gear of this lamb. There's 2 hemispheres, one showing each of the 2 hemispheres of Earth. Underneath it says, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. It came in peace." I guess you're about the only person around that doesn't have TV coverage of the scene. That's all right, I don't mind a bit. How is the quality of the TV? Oh, it's beautiful, Mike. It really is. Oh, geez, that's great. Is the lighting halfway decent? Yes, indeed. They've got the flag up now, and you can see the stars and stripes on the...
The other part of JFK's New Frontier is also his domestic agenda for the United States. So most presidents will have like a domestic agenda. And one of the big things that Kennedy really wanted to focus on was to address poverty in America. In 1962, Michael Harrington had published the expose, The Other America, which highlighted the issue of poverty in the United States. And as part of Kennedy's New Frontier, ended up including legislation that increased the minimum wage, extended Social Security, and improved government assistance programs. It also included the Equal Pay Act of 1963, which required equal wages for equal work in certain industries. And in 1964, Congress passed legislation that prohibited discrimination by employers on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, or sex. Both of those are important on their own. They're also important in this broader context of civil rights movements, not just for African Americans, but for basically everyone. And it'll definitely play a role in especially the women's rights movement that we'll talk about in later weeks. Unfortunately, John F. Kennedy is assassinated in 1963 while he was pre-campaigning, I guess, for the 1964 election. He was in Texas and he was shot while riding in a motorcade in Dallas, specifically by Lee Harvey Oswald. And afterwards, the United States kind of goes through like a collective mourning for the then youngest for the youngest president. After John F. Kennedy's assassination, his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, is sworn in as president. Lyndon B. Johnson was a seasoned politician. He had worked in Texas politics as well as like national politics for quite a while. And his domestic program was called the Great Society. And in describing this, it's a little bit later, not quite right when he's sworn in, but in 1965, he says that I do not want to be the president who built empires or sought grandeur or extended dominion. I want to be the president who educated young children, who helped to feed the hungry, who helped the poor to find their own way. And so that was sort of like how he envisioned his domestic program. One of the things that is notable about Lyndon B. Johnson is because he'd been in politics so long, or maybe it's because he's from Texas, you can probably take your pick of possible reasons why, but he was quite good on building coalitions within Congress in order to get his legislation passed. And so some of the measures that John F. Kennedy had hoped for and either not had enough time to get to or was unable to build support for, Lyndon B. Johnson was actually able to get passed into law. Two of those are the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which we're going to talk about later on. But another one is also the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 abolished the quota system that had been established by the 1924 Immigration Act. Immigration Act, which had American immigration, which for the past several decades had effectively barred legal immigration from anywhere other than like Northern and Western Europe, mostly, finally had reopened up to the rest of the world. And this would reshape the demographics of the United States immigration for the remainder of the 20th century and into the 21st century. Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society really focused on quality of life concerns, and that possibly makes sense based on kind of how he described it. Remember, he said that he wanted to be the president who educated children, helped feed the hungry, and who helped the poor. Well, these legislations address things like it was the first federal food stamp program came out of the Great Society. Medicare and Medicaid would ensure access to quality medical care for the aged and the poor. And in 1965, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was the first sustained and significant federal investment in public education, totaling more than $1 billion that went to colleges and universities. Right. So this is all quality of life. This is ensuring people have food to eat, that they have access to healthcare, and that they have access to education and access to quality education. The Great Society also established the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. These are federal investments in the arts that fund American arts and culture to this day. And a lot of universities and communities can and do apply for like NEH grants. That was introduced during Lyndon B. Johnson's term that sought to address the high rates of poverty. Remember, this is also something that Kennedy had been interested in. And we're going to watch a quick video.
Lyndon Johnson wanted to be a great president. And I think he understood we had developed this broad middle class, but there were many groups that were completely left out. if he could do something that had never been done before in America, and that was actually attack the root causes of poverty, transform America, it would be a legacy that no other president would have had.
This administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
What he spells out to that Congress, it's unprecedented. He says, we're not just going to try to alleviate poverty, we're going to try and end it. Johnson understands poverty and race are inextricably mixed in the great injustice in America. He is the president who has this vision of a vast domestic reform, of justice. You know, Martin Luther King said, the moral arc of the universe bends slowly, but it bends towards justice. In 1964, Lyndon Johnson is trying to bend that arc faster.
Join with me in working for a nation that is free from want, and a world that is free from hate.
For Johnson, the ghost of John Kennedy was huge in 1964. When Kennedy was killed, it was felt that somehow this was a plot to stop progress. Johnson has to make people feel that the spirit of John Kennedy is living on. Although in doing that, he would do much more than John Kennedy actually ever did.
At the time, Johnson's war on poverty did end up facing criticisms from both the left and the right. And like in the other cases, when we've kind of talked about this happening, people on the left didn't think he had gone far enough. And then people on the right thought these programs had gone too far. Another important part of Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency is also the Vietnam War. And we're going to talk about that next week. Culture and activism. The counterculture of the 1960s, I just want to touch on this kind of briefly, is most often categorized as a group of people who oppose societal norms. There is debate about that definition for counterculture and who falls into the counterculture. But that is a pretty good, a pretty general description. But even so, it's a really broad categorization, and a lot of different types of people from a lot of different movements could technically fall under that, which is one of the critiques. The counterculture movement from the early 1960s through the 1970s is heavily identified with music. And I think like the hippies, for example, are probably like the most like well-known like and like iconic imagery or of this time period's counterculture. And we've mentioned sort of like counterculture a couple of times, either through lecture or in the text. And you're always going to have a counterculture movement. You're always going to have people who are pushing back against societal norms in some way, shape, or form, either because they are intentionally pushing against those norms or because it is like a fact of their lived experience and how they live that is in opposition to or pushes against the mainstream or standard societal norms. And so I've just included two artists, Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix, as sort of representative of this time period. One of the most sort of like well-known events of sort of this 1960s counterculture is that it kind of culminates into Woodstock 1969. It was advertised as 3 days of peace and music. The Woodstock Music Festival was one of the largest gatherings for those of the counterculture movement from August 15th to August 18th, 1969, with performers like Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix. Although there was a huge lack of organization, and it really could have been a disaster, but it's pretty widely remembered very fondly. Um, and a lot of festivals have since tried to recreate it. There's even like later iterations of Woodstock. Um, but by and large, I think most people would say that the 1969, like you couldn't redo it. There's a lot to talk about in this kind of like counterculture slash hippie movement slash youth movement. And there's a lot of critiques of it, as well as there's a lot of proponents of it as well. But if that's something that you're super interested in, I can give you some reading recommendations if you want to shoot me an email, because we're moving on to case law. We will also be going over some landmark cases from the Supreme Court. A number of these are possibly going to be on your civic literacy exam, which this is a reminder, you do have to take your civic literacy exam in order to graduate, and it's free to take the exam while you're in this class. Just a brief reminder. So we're going to do a quick review of the Bill of Rights and the 14th Amendment, because those are going to come up a lot as we talk about the case law, and I thought it'd be best just to do a quick refresher.
The First Amendment is the freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly, and petition. This may be the most revered of the amendments. The First Amendment protects our rights to say and write our opinions, worship how we please, assemble together peacefully, and petition our government if we feel the need. The Second Amendment is the right to bear arms. The original intent of the Second Amendment was to protect colonists from the invading British soldiers, but it now guarantees that you have the right to own a gun to defend yourself and your property. The Third Amendment is called the Quartering Amendment. It was written in response to the British occupation and as a result of the colonists having to house or quarter soldiers in their homes during the American Revolution. Because of this amendment, our government can never force us to house soldiers in our home. The Fourth Amendment is the right to search and seizure. The police can't come into our home without a search warrant and take our personal property. Today, many concerns have arisen about our rights to privacy and technology. For example, can the government track your location with your smartphone, or can social media postings such as on Facebook and Twitter be used without a warrant? On to the fifth. It's all about due process. You've probably heard the phrase, "I plead the fifth," in movies or on TV. They're talking about the Fifth Amendment, which says that you don't have to take the witness stand against yourself if you may end up incriminating yourself. Okay, we're halfway done. The Sixth and Seventh Amendments are about how the legal system works. If you're accused of a crime, you have the right to a speedy public trial and an impartial jury. You also have the right to a lawyer and the right to take the stand if you choose. This is important because it will prevent the accused from sitting in prison forever and insists that the prosecution proceed with undue delay. The Seventh says you have the right to a jury trial where 12 impartial peers decide your innocence or guilt in the courtroom, as opposed to a judge doing it all alone. The Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Is a death penalty cruel? Is it unusual? It's hard for Americans to agree on the definitions of cruel and unusual. The Ninth and 10th Amendments are called the non-rights amendments. They say that the rights not listed in the Bill of Rights are retained by the people in the states. You have other rights that are not listed in the Constitution, and the states have the right to make their own policies, like instituting state taxes. So, now you know all 10 amendments.
And the 14th Amendment, there's actually 5 sections, but I'm only going to highlight section 1, and that is all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And again, I thought it best to review these because they come up a couple of times in the cases that we are about to cover. And especially this particular section, and especially that equal protection of the laws clause. So I just want to make sure we were all kind of on the same page and using the same language before we move on. So one thing to note, all of the cases that we are going to cover in this lecture are coming out of the Warren Court. And the Warren Court is called so because it's of its Chief Justice, Earl Warren. It's probably one of the most famous periods in Supreme Court history. Whether you love the court or hate the court, it's one of the most famous ones. And if anyone is interested in studying law enforcement, or civil rights, I really recommend that you study this court more in depth because their legislative decisions, their decisions had a huge impact on the time period, but also continue to have long lasting impacts and implications on American culture and law. So, just a brief overview of some of the changes that happened as a result of the court. This is from a book on the Warren Court called Democracy and Equality. Before Warren joined the court, school districts in 17 American states required Black school children to go to different schools from white children. In 27 states, it was illegal for a Black person to marry a white person. Every state in the nation violated the principle of one person, one vote, many of them grotesquely so. Government officials could sue their critics for ruinous damages for incorrect statements, even if the critics acted in good faith. Members of the Communist Party and other dissenters could be criminally prosecuted for their speech. Married couples could be denied access to contraception. Public school teachers led their classes in overtly religious prayers. Police officers could interrogate suspects without telling them their rights. People were convicted of crimes on the basis of evidence that police officers had seized illegally. And criminal defendants who could not afford a lawyer had no right to a public defender. They did a lot. In short, they did a lot this court did a lot, and we're not going to talk about every single one of these cases. But again, if you are interested in the court and you're interested in, like I said, like going to studying law or going into law enforcement or studying this time period more, you should definitely check out the court at length. The first case we're going to look at is Mapp v. Ohio. This took place in 1961. This is a case that originated in, you guessed it, Ohio, when police officers forced their way into Miss Mapp's house without a proper search warrant. They did this because they believed that she was harboring a suspected bomber, and so they demanded entry. But they did not have a warrant, right? So when no suspect was found, the police were searching the home, and they ended up finding a trunk of obscene pictures in the basement. Mapp was arrested for possessing the pictures and was ultimately convicted in an Ohio court. And then she argued that her Fourth Amendment rights had been violated by the search and took it to court. Eventually, this case reached the Supreme Court, and the question to the court was, were the confiscated materials protected from seizure by the Fourth Amendment? And the Supreme Court ended up ruling that the prosecution is not allowed to present evidence that law enforcement secured during a search that was unconstitutional under the Fourth Amendment. And so what that means is that it would exclude all evidence that was obtained in methods that violated the Fourth Amendment, like without a search warrant. And so this ruling impacted public life moving forward, and it caused a massive shift in the way that policing was done, in the way that law enforcement interacted with the public. So, very big landmark case. The next case, Baker v. Carr, 1962. In this case, Charles Baker and other Tennessee citizens alleged that a 1901 law designed to apportion the seats for the state's General Assembly had been ignored. And so they sued, saying that Tennessee's reapportionment efforts ignored the significant economic growth and population shifts that had taken place in the state since 1901. And that this meant that the votes of people in rural areas had a proportionally greater value than the votes of people in urban areas. And so they sued, saying that that they were denied equal protection of the laws under the 14th Amendment because it was Baker's suit, so because his vote was devalued. So the question to the court became, did the Supreme Court even have jurisdiction over questions of legislative apportionment? So not, was this a violation of the 14th Amendment? The real question is, can the Supreme Court even do anything about this? And so ultimately, the Supreme Court ruled that drawing lines around state electoral districts can be reviewed by courts because the political question doctrine does not apply. And so the political question doctrine is when a political question is a subject matter that the Supreme Court deems to be inappropriate for judicial review because discretionary power over it should be left to politically accountable branches of government. And then do the separation of powers. This had really far-reaching implications, like most of the landmark cases that we're going to talk about, to be honest, in that by opening the redistricting process up to judicial review, it prompted a lot of lawsuits across the country. And within a couple of years, by 1966, so within like 4 years, 46 states had to redo their redistricting because they'd been sued and had to go under this judicial review, or did their redistricting so that they didn't get sued, one or the other. This case laid the groundwork for creating what the idea of the one person, one vote principle. And yeah, that's why sometimes you hear about like voting districts or voting redistricting having to like go to court. This case plays a huge role in that, and like that still happens today. Like in the last like year or so, there's been states that have gone to court about this, so still very applicable. The next case we have is Engel v. Vitale from 1962. And in this case, the New York State Board of Regents authorized a short voluntary prayer for recitation at the start of each school day. And a group of organizations decided to challenge the prayer, claiming that it violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. And so they sued. And for context, I will read the actual prayer to you. It's, Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon thee, and we beg thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country. And so the question before the court is, does the reading of a non-denominational prayer at the start of the school day violate the Establishment of Religion Clause of the First Amendment? And remember, the Establishment Clause, quote, provides that Congress make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And the ruling was that the state cannot hold prayers in public schools, even if it's not required and not tied to a particular religion. And The main implication of this is that public schools aren't supposed to have prayer. But they're like the court has held fairly consistent in this in cases that have followed it. So in Wallace v. Jaffrey in 1985, a middle school graduation, I'm sorry, in Wallace v. Jaffrey in 1985, the court ruled against an Alabama law requiring a moment of silence that appeared to have been rewritten specifically to encourage school prayer. They similarly ruled against a middle school graduation school prayer in Lee v. Wiseman in 1992 and prayer at a high school football game in Santa Fe Independent School District v. Doe in 2000. So they've held fairly consistent to that, or at least they did through the 20th century. Gideon v. Wainwright. This is actually a case that came out of Florida, fun fact. And so Clarence Earl Gideon was charged in Florida state court with felony breaking and entering. And when he appeared before the court without a lawyer, he requested one, and he was denied. And so he represented himself in trial, and he was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years in prison. And he sued. It makes its way to the Supreme Court, and the question is, does the Sixth Amendment's right to counsel in criminal cases extend to felony defendants in state courts? In a unanimous decision, the Supreme Court established that the 14th Amendment creates a right for criminal defendants who cannot pay for their own lawyers and to have the state appoint attorneys on their behalf if they can't afford one. The court reasoned that the Sixth Amendment's guarantee of counsel is a fundamental and essential right made obligatory upon the states by the 14th Amendment. And as you can imagine, this had pretty far-reaching implications in that it required state courts to follow the same right to counsel rule that federal courts already had to follow. And from that point on, a person with no legal counsel was no longer forced to defend themselves against crimes and that state courts could deem unworthy of court-appointed counsel. So anyone who wants a court-appointed counsel can have one. And so that's something that we're pretty used to, but that was not the case up until 1963. Miranda v. Arizona in 1966. This case is actually the consolidation of 4 different cases. And in every single one of the cases, the defendant, while in police custody, was questioned either by police officers, detectives, or a prosecuting attorney in a room in which he was cut off from the outside world, was not allowed to leave, and was essentially interrogated, and was not given full and effective warning of their rights prior to the interrogation process. And in all of the cases, this line of questioning or this process ended up in all of the defendants giving an oral admission to a crime, and then they were convicted. So the question before the Supreme Court is, does the Fifth Amendment's protection against self-incrimination extend to police interrogation of a suspect? And the Supreme Court ruled that under the Fifth Amendment, any statements that a defendant in custody makes during interrogation are admissible as evidence at a criminal trial only if law enforcement told the defendant of the right to remain silent and right to speak with an attorney before the interrogation started, and then that those rights were either exercised or waived in full understanding of what they were doing. And so the implication of that is that's how we get the Miranda rights. So anyone who's seen an episode of like Law and Order knows your Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney, and if you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. So that's how we got that. And in the last case we will be talking about is Tinker v. Des Moines from 1969. A group of students in 1965 decided that they would wear black armbands in a public showing of their support for a truce of the Vietnam War. And somehow the principals of their school found out about this plan. And the day prior to when they were supposed to start wearing their armbands, shortly before, created a policy that stated that any student wearing an armband would be asked to remove it, with refusal to doing so resulting in suspension. And so on December 16th, like 2 days later, Mary Beth Tinker and Christopher Eckhart wore their armbands to school and were sent home. And then the students, through their parents, ended up suing the school for violating the students' right of expression. And so then the question before the court is, does a prohibition against the wearing of armbands in public school as a form of symbolic protest violate the students' free speech protections guaranteed by the First Amendment? And ultimately, the court ruled that since the First Amendment protections extend to students in public schools, educational authorities who want to censor speech have to show that permitting that speech would significantly interfere with the discipline needed for the school to function. So essentially, the onus is on school administrators to prove that the speech they wish to censor would have a negative impact on like school activities and cause like disruption. And kind of famously, one of the justices stated that it, quote, can hardly be argued that either students or teachers shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate, end quote. And so what kind of impact did this ultimately have on schools? It would, and that is that even the court has essentially that even if a topic is controversial and some disruption may occur, expressive conduct is protected by the First Amendment, even for students. Since the decisions since Tinker have kind of shifted away from this a little bit. And so, what's the impact of this? Essentially, even if a topic is controversial and some disruption may occur, expressive conduct is protected by the First Amendment. I'm going to play this quick video from the ACLU, and it's particularly interesting because it includes an interview with the students from this case. So let's watch.
Hey, John, it's Mary Beth.
Hi, Mary Beth. Great to be here.
Yes.
We're going to talk about the armband case, Tinker v. Des Moines.
What an experience that's been.
Hasn't it been? Yes. We never really had any idea it would turn into this, did we?
No idea that this would become such an important ruling for students' rights.
That's right.
So we grew up in Des Moines, Iowa, where our father was a Methodist minister, and then we became Quakers. And so by 1965, I was 13 years old in 8th grade, and John was 15 years old in 10th grade.
And the war in Vietnam was developing steam at that point. People were starting to be killed, and a lot of us wanted to protest against the war. And someone mentioned that wearing black armbands was going to be one way that people would protest.
The principals in Des Moines heard about our plans through the high school newspaper at Roosevelt High School. And so they made a rule against armbands, saying that anyone who wore a black armband to school would be suspended.
That's right. Our dad said to me that he wasn't so sure that I should violate their decision.
So what did you say, John?
Well, I said, Dad, this is just a black piece of cloth, and people in Vietnam are dying. And Dad said to me, well, then for you, it's a matter of conscience. I said, I guess it is. And he said, well, then I support you. You had already left for school.
Yeah, I didn't know. I was really nervous and scared, but one of my favorite teachers was standing at the door with a pink pass to go to the office. And so I took the pass and I went down to the office and my heart was beating. And then I got there and Mr. Willitson, the vice principal, said, Mary Beth, that's against the rules, so take off your armband. So I looked at Mr. Willitson, I looked around the office, and in a great stand of courage, I said, okay, Mr. Willitson. I took off the armband, and the girl's advisor, Mrs. Tarman, said, now, Mary Beth, since you wore that armband and broke the rules, you are going to be suspended.
You know, when I wore my armband, I went to the cafeteria for lunch, and some kids came over and called me a coward and a communist.
We think there were maybe around 10 or a few less that wore the black armbands, but 5 were suspended.
And so we sought legal advice from the Iowa Civil Liberties Union lawyer, and he recommended that we sue the school board in the federal court for violating our First Amendment rights. And so that's what we did.
He really helped us kids feel like there was hope and that we were safe, because by this time, really mean people were coming around. Some people threw red paint at our house. Someone threw a brick through the window. And then one day, a phone rang and the lady said, is this Mary Beth? And I said, yes. And she said, I'm going to kill you. And I couldn't believe that someone was so hateful just because we had spoken up for peace at Christmas time.
We took the case first to the federal district court in Des Moines, and we lost there. And so we appealed to the Supreme Court, and we won 7-2.
On February 24th, 1969, Supreme Court Justice Abe Fortas declared that neither students or teachers shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate.
And so that's become probably the most well-known phrase from our case.
I was so happy. And our mother went out and bought some ice cream and soda pop that night.
Yeah.
We found a way to deal with our grief, which was to take action. And it helped us a lot. It helped young people to be able to speak up and stand up when the Supreme Court said that they had a right to do that.
And so that's the last case for this case law section. Unless, in case it wasn't clear, these will be on the exam. All right. Section 3, the long civil rights movement. Before we can talk about this, I thought it would be important to explain what I mean when I'm referring to the phrase like the long civil rights movement. And part of the reason why I thought it would be best to combine a whole lot of information from 2 chapters into one. The long civil rights movement is a term or a framework that historians use sometimes to study civil rights history by expanding the time period that you're looking at beyond the typical sort of like 1955 to 1965 or like 1954 to 1968 time period and into something much longer. And depending on the historian, it usually will look like something from Reconstruction all the way up to the present day, or sometimes they'll end it in the 80s, depending on sort of the way they're using this framework or the way that they are looking at the context of the civil rights movement or sort of the details that historians are trying to connect will depend on sort of the beginning and end dates that they use. But if you remember when we first talked about Reconstruction, and I said, we start this class in 1877 because that's typically the end of the Reconstruction era, but it's kind of like a soft end. It's a fuzzy end because depending on where you are in the country and what specifically you're looking at, maybe it's not 1877, maybe it's 1874, maybe it's 1879, maybe it's 1880. It kind of depends. The civil rights movement is like that. The dates are like soft and fuzzy beginning and end dates because depending on what specifically you're looking at, um, and what part of the country you're looking at. Are you looking at more urban areas? Are you looking at more rural areas? Are you looking at the Southeast, the West Coast? All of that can make a really big difference. And I like to explain this and I like to put this information together in order to really contextualize it. I think a lot of times when people talk about the civil rights movement, it seems kind of like finite and like it starts in 1955 uh, with Brown v. Board of Education, and it ends with the Civil Rights Act of 1968, and that's it, and that's done. And that's not, I think, a great way to look at it. Because even if that is like the civil rights movement, quotes, all caps, titling and all, it's not it's not like people have not been fighting for civil rights this entire time. Essentially, since the Declaration of Independence was written, um, people have been fighting for civil rights. And I'll talk about this a little bit later on because it's referenced by civil rights leaders and saying that, you know, you write these founding documents of the United States, they're great, they're revolutionary, we love them. Why don't they apply to us? And that's kind of like the bigger question, followed by, and how can we make it so that it does? That kind of is the stream that follows from Declaration of Independence to the Constitution through the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments into like the modern civil rights movement that we're talking about. And so, yeah, so we're going to get started. So understanding that there's a lot going on that we don't really touch on. If this is something that interests you, there's so much information. We're really only like skimming the tip top of the mountain of the iceberg of things that we could talk about. And so I hope something sparks your interest and you'd like to dive deeper. Oh, this is more about the civil rights movement. The long civil rights movement, excuse me. We've actually talked about some of the people already. For example, we've talked about Ida B. Wells, we've talked about W.E.B. Du Bois, and we've talked about James Weldon Johnson, all in different chapters in the last couple of times. That was not wholly unintentional, knowing I was going to talk about the long civil rights movement, but also because like their work is foundational to what we're talking about today. So we're going to start in the 1950s because that was last week's chapter. And I've made this little timeline. Do take notes. The timelines will go through the 1950s and the 1960s. And then I'll talk about the elements that are in here. Not every single one of these will be on your exam necessarily, but I would go into the exam with a pretty good understanding of all of these if I were you. We were going to start with 1953. Sarah Keyes is publicly challenges public transportation laws. Sarah was serving in the Women's Army Corps and traveled from her Army base in New Jersey back to North Carolina to visit her family. The driver asked her to give up her seat for a white customer, and she refused. And doing so landed her in jail in 1953 that led to a 1955 landmark decision, Sarah Keyes versus Carolina Coach Company. You don't need to remember this case. It just is important for when we talk about the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. But the Interstate Commerce Commission ruled that separate but equal violated the Interstate Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution. This was poorly enforced, but it gave the legal coverage and the legality needed for the freedom riders later on. I'm sorry, I said Montgomery bus boycott. The freedom riders, which we're going to talk about. This happens in 1953, but it's important for how it connects to, it's important on its own, but it's also important for how it connects to the freedom rides. So Brown v. Board of Education, we talked about this last week. It is the landmark case that states that separate but equal educational facilities for racial minorities is inherently unequal, violating the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. We're not going to go over this in detail because we talked about it last week, just something to remember. In the summer of 1955, Emmett Till is murdered. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old kid from Chicago visiting family in Mississippi when he allegedly whistled at a white woman named Carolyn Bryant, and her husband and another man, J.W. Millam, abducted and murdered Emmett Till. He was shot and his body was mutilated and he was thrown into the Tallahatchie River. His mother, Mamie Till, famously held an open casket funeral so that Emmett Till's body could be seen and could make national news in order to force the American public to recognize and reconcile like what had happened to her child. She even allowed journalists to take photos of his body in the casket to publish that image on the cover of Jet magazine. And people were outraged. The two men were brought to trial, and even though there were witnesses and lots of evidence, they were found not guilty by an all-white jury. Months after the decision, the two men boasted and admitted to their crime in a magazine, which is how we know exactly how it happened and that they did it. This case became sort of like a catalyst for people and propelled the civil rights movement forward. A lot of people were driven to action, not only hearing the story, especially because he was so young, but also by being able to see like how brutalized he was. I have chosen in this lecture not to show the image for a number of reasons. One, they're very difficult to look at as someone who's seen them a number of times and has studied this for years. I still have a hard time looking at it. But if it is something and you would like to learn more, you absolutely can find images very easily with a quick Google search. And I also recommend the National African American Museum also has an amazing exhibit if you're ever in DC, but they also have like a digital version that you can look at and see. I also have an image of Paul Robeson, who was an actor and involved in the civil rights movement as well. And he sent a telegram in response to the acquittal. And it kind of is just representative of how a lot of people felt to varying degrees. But like I said, people were really like driven to change, not only by the event, but the fact that there was like no justice done. And so, yeah. From the winter of 1955, fall winter of 1955 to 1956, we have the Montgomery bus boycott. And we're going to play this quick video. One of the best parts of studying civil rights history is there's so much primary source material There's a lot of oral histories, there's a lot of video, there's a lot of photos. And so it's fantastic from a historian's perspective because there's so much to learn. And there's a lot of folks that are actually still alive that participated in a lot of these movements. And so you can actually like just ask people. But here's a quick video.
The December 1955 arrest of Rosa Parks for refusing to give up her seat on a bus to white passengers sparked the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott. The boycott against the segregated bus system was supposed to last one day, but an estimated 17,000 African Americans supported it. The boycott lasted more than a year. The community's enthusiasm led organizers to extend the protest and appoint a spokesman. That person turned out to be a young Montgomery minister, Dr. Martin Luther King. Opponents of the boycott resorted to many tactics to deter and intimidate protesters from participating. Among those tactics, legal harassment. On February 21, 1956, a Montgomery, Alabama grand jury indicted 89 leaders of the boycott, including Dr. King and the Reverend Ralph Abernathy. Their crime? Violating a 1921 state statute forbidding boycotts without, quote, just cause. Along with the indictment, the grand jury issued a report repudiating the anti-segregation efforts. Grand jurors wrote, quote, in this state, we are committed to segregation by custom of law. We intend to maintain it. Of the nearly 90 people indicted, Dr. King was the only one to be prosecuted. He was convicted, fined $1,000, and given a suspended jail sentence of 1 year of hard labor. As the strength of the boycotters grew, the intimidation turned violent. The homes of several leaders, including Dr. King's house, were bombed. On the night of August 25, 1956, several sticks of dynamite were thrown into the yard of Pastor Robert Gretz, an outspoken supporter of the boycott. Pastor Gretz was a young white minister serving the city's primarily black Trinity Lutheran Church. He was also a member of the Montgomery Improvement Association, the primary group that planned and guided the city's bus boycott. Pastor Gretz was in Tennessee at the time of the explosion. His wife and children also were not home, and no one was injured. Shortly after the boycott began, organizers filed a federal lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of Montgomery's segregated buses. The lawsuit worked its way through the courts as the boycott continued. And on November 13, 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that public bus segregation was unconstitutional and ordered Montgomery buses to integrate. On December 21, 1956, one day after the Montgomery bus system was served the court's order, the boycott ended, and the city's black citizens resumed riding the buses.
And in 1957, the Civil Rights Act of 1957 was passed. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 was the first civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. And this new act established the Civil Rights Section of the Justice Department and empowered federal prosecutors to obtain court injunctions against interference with the right to vote. It also established a federal civil rights commission with authority to investigate discriminatory conditions and recommend corrective measures. And so that is the 1950s. Of course, there's a lot going on, but those are some of the highlights, which takes us right on into the 1960s. So we start with 1960 proper and the Greensboro sit-in. The Greensboro sit-ins was where activists sat at segregated lunch counters in an act of defiance, refusing to leave until being served. And they were willing to suffer through being ridiculed, attacked, having like food thrown on them, being arrested. And these started in Greensboro, North Carolina, but they actually happened throughout the South. And in fact, there were ones that took place in both Tallahassee and Jacksonville as well. And this was predominantly done by students, which I think is a really important part of both the 1960, both the sit-ins as well as the freedom rides that we'll talk about, and even sort of the integration of higher education and just education in general, right? Because a lot of this is being driven by young people. That's not to say that there aren't older, more established people who are involved in these organizations and programs and movements. There absolutely are. But also, a lot of these things are being driven by high school, college, mid 20 something people. And so a lot of the sit ins were done near college campuses. And so, like, there's a college campus in Greensboro, and this is where this happens. The one in Tallahassee, I think, takes place, if I'm remembering correctly, like near FAMU and Florida State. And so, which makes sense. And then, of course, the school integrations, both the K-12 and higher education ones, are typically happening by pretty young people. Occasionally, you have like grad students who are a little bit older, but usually they're like anywhere from elementary school, like Ruby Bridges, all the way to like college age students like James Meredith at Ole Miss. And so that's kind of like who's very like iconically leading this movement in the 1960s. The Freedom Rides were organized primarily by activists in the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. Just there's a number of organizations that are helping to organize these events. Of course, you have the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Color People, and they're especially heavily involved in like the legislative part. They, of course, do other things, but notably they're involved in legislation. As I talked about before, we mentioned Sarah Keyes and how, remember, she was arrested and went to court, and the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on these interstate buses was a violation of the Interstate Commerce Commission, or the Interstate Commerce Clause of the US Constitution, but it wasn't really being enforced. And so CORE, activists in CORE, organized interstate bus rides in order to like make this law be enforced, right? And so they got on buses starting in Washington, D.C., and they were bussed through the South, and they encountered fierce opposition. You can see the bottom photo of the Greyhound bus carrying Freedom Riders was actually like firebombed by an angry mob, and they were harassed when they would stop for food, and they actually had to have like National Guardsmen come and protect them in order to like complete these freedom rides. And ultimately, as a result of these, and mind you, all this is happening and it's being televised nationally. So everybody is seeing this. And so as a result, ultimately, the Interstate Commerce Commission enforced integrated interstate buses and trains in fall of 1961. In 1963, we have the March on Washington, which was a push for legislation and jobs and for major civil rights legislation. I'm only going to touch on this briefly because I think it's pretty well known. Most famously, Martin Luther King delivers his I Have a Dream speech. And again, while I believe this is pretty well known, and if you haven't read it, it's super short, it's like maybe 2 pages. So I do recommend just giving it a quick read. But in his speech, he says something that I referenced earlier, right? And he refers to the founding documents as promissory notes. And he frames it as African Americans demanding, not quite requesting, but demanding to be afforded the same equalities stated in those documents, right? So the quote on the screen is, in a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, Black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So I just wanted to touch on this like particular line, especially since it was something I mentioned earlier on. So in 1964, we have two pieces of legislation that are passed. And we have the 24th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The 24th Amendment essentially eliminates poll taxes and makes them not just illegal, but unconstitutional. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is considered by some to be the most important piece of civil rights legislation in American history. It's a pretty comprehensive act that bars segregation in public accommodations and outlaws discrimination based on race, ethnicity, gender, and national or religious origin. And this, when we say public accommodations, we're talking about hotels, transportation, restaurants, all of this. And this and some of the other legislation I'll touch on in a second are important for a lot of reasons. They have implications later on. And so Title VII of 1964 specifically is where we get the phrase on the basis of sex, which plays a huge role in the women's rights movement. And we'll circle back to that when we get there. But this is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Yes, I'm talking about like Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement for Black Americans, but it's also really important, I think, to understand that like it's not just African Americans who are doing things at this time. I'm choosing to focus on that because a lot of the legislation and a lot of the things that we cover are like kind of directly tied to some of these events. And they're kind of like I said, this tip top of the iceberg that is really good to form like the frame of your understanding for this time period around. But like this Civil Rights Act of 1964 helps way more than just Black Americans, right? Because it includes race, ethnicity, gender, national, or religious origin. So there are a lot of people who are actively fighting for civil rights and for equality at this point in time. The women's rights movement never like stopped, like the civil rights movement that continues on. Right now, the book touches on the like indigenous rights movement that's also going on, as well as the Chicano movement that's going on now. All of this is happening at the same time, and it's so much information. But it is the results and the culmination of all of these different groups that is ultimately what gets this legislation passed. It's never just one person. It's not just Martin Luther King. It's not just one group of people. It's everybody. And I think that's just kind of something I wanted to make sure I stated at some point in this lecture. And so we kind of wrap up the 1960s with the March on Selma, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Civil Rights Act of 1968. And so the March on Selma takes place in 1965, and it is, or the March from Selma, March on Selma. And it's because activists march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. And this march is specifically for voting rights. Because even though the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is passed, it's not enough. Only 20% of African Americans were registered to vote. And that's because there are still a lot of barriers in place at this time. And so this is a push for more comprehensive voting rights legislation. And on this march, the first time activists try to march from Selma to Montgomery, they are attacked by law enforcement and protesters who have batons and tear gas, and they are turned away violently. The second time, they're also turned away violently. And the third time, they finally end up making what is a 50-mile trek from Selma to Montgomery. And this takes place on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, which if you ever see like a picture of someone's talking about this and you see it on a bridge, that's the bridge. And also, this is something that John Lewis is a part of. He was also part of the Freedom Rides. I think I actually included a picture of him, but since we're talking about the March on Selma, I thought I would briefly grab my book. So this is a graphic novel that is written in part by John Lewis, who I mentioned, and he is part of the Civil Rights Movement, and he would go on to to participate in politics all the way up into like the 21st century, and he just recently passed away like a couple of years ago. And in this graphic novel, it like this is the bridge, right? And it tells the story of the march. The artwork is great. The story is from his perspective, and it's a trilogy, and there's also a sequel as well. I feel like now I'm just like showing off my book collection at this point. But yeah, they're really great. These are really great. I can't recommend like historical graphic novels enough. I think they're really fun. I think they're fun. They're obviously like gorgeous artwork, and they're a good way if you're interested in history but not willing to like commit to a 400-page like annotated book monograph, then they're a really good option. And so next we have the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This is prompted honestly by the March from Selma is televised, and so after that, President Johnson presents the bill that would ultimately become the Voting Rights Act of 1965, right? And it is an act that abolishes voting discrimination in federal, state, and local elections. And it's based in part on the enforcement clause of the 15th Amendment. And it's one of the most significant statutory changes in the relationship between the federal and state governments around voting since the Reconstruction era. And between 1965, when this was passed, and 1969, the Supreme Court issued several key decisions upholding the constitutionality of Section 5 and affirming the broad range of voting practices for which preclearance, which is what this is about, was required. This has continued to get legislated on. It's gone to the Supreme Court a couple of times. One of the more recent instances of where this was before the Supreme Court, or a part of this was before the Supreme Court, was Shelby County v. Holder, if y'all remember that. And then 1968, we have the Civil Rights Act of 1968. And so, again, if you remember that, like I said, there's a lot of different people who are fighting for equity and civil rights at this point in time. And this Civil Rights Act of 1968 also kind of really alludes to that in the same way that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did. Sections 2 through 7 actually apply many of the protections within the Bill of Rights to federally recognized indigenous tribes. So the free exercise of religion, freedom of speech, freedom from unreasonable search and seizures, not having to testify against yourself in criminal cases, right? So these Bill of Rights that we just talked about now in 1968 also apply and to federally recognized indigenous tribes. There is more to that because there's 5 sections, but that's a quick summary. Sections 8 and 9 of the Civil Rights Act of 1968 are known as the Fair Housing Act, or I guess the whole thing is, but it's sections 8 and 9 that have to do with fair housing. And it was an expansion on the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 68. And it prohibited the discrimination concerning the sale, rental, or financing of housing based on race, religion, national origin, and sex. And this was again due to action from many groups, including Black Americans, Mexican Americans, Indigenous Americans, and Jewish Americans, all of whom were facing unfair housing practices. I know we talked about redlining in the last chapter, but you also had cases of people refusing to sell someone a house, or HOAs not letting people in, or all kinds of unfair housing practices that were most negatively impacting minority groups. And so this helped everybody. And so the last thing I kind of want to talk about is, as you know, typically when we talk about a thing, I also then, a lot of times point out this is what happened, but not everybody was happy about it. I think for the most part, that is kind of understood, right? In this civil rights legislation, is the fact that we have to do this is because some people aren't happy about it. The reason why there were such violent interactions on the March on Selma and during the Freedom Rides is because some people aren't happy about it. But there's also people who are critiquing the civil rights movement who are kind of aligned with it, right? And one of the things that comes out of that is the Black Power movement, which typically by the time you get through the civil rights movement, they're like, okay, that's enough. We got to move on. Lecture's already been way too long. And so I have a quick video I'm going to play for you. But again, like everything else, tip of the iceberg, right? I'll play the video, and then if I have more to say, I'll talk afterwards.
In 1965, President Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, bringing down one of the last legal vestiges of Jim Crow segregation. Just 5 days later, an altercation between an unarmed black man and the police sparked riots on the streets of Watts, a predominantly black neighborhood in Los Angeles. The riots revealed that America still faced deep racial issues, and in the coming years, urban unrest roiled cities across the nation.
Dr. King's message of nonviolence wore thin as the 1960s progressed, particularly because violence is everywhere.
As race relations deteriorated, Stokely Carmichael, a young, charismatic, electrifying speaker, was searching for a new way to reframe the civil rights struggle. And he found it through one resonant metaphor.
It's time we stand up and take over. Don't be afraid. Don't be ashamed. We want black power. We want black power. We want black power.
The civil rights movement had been extraordinarily successful, but there has not necessarily been the tangible transformation in black people's living conditions. Carmichael is making an argument that only black power will take black people to that next level.
Hey, what do you want? That's what we gonna get.
The effect was electrifying. Soon after, black power groups were organizing across the country, each with their own idea about what the phrase actually meant.
You had everybody from those that are saying, yes, let's go for elected office, to those that say, let's overthrow the government.
It called for self-determination. It called for an end to nonviolence as the only strategy of the black movement.
Looking back, black power marked a startling shift in the civil rights movement and in the evolution of black consciousness.
Black power is really going to inspire a whole new wave of black elected officials and inspire the black arts movement, using culture to transform what we think of as black identity, proud, strong black women and men.
Black, the word that for decades so many African Americans most dreaded being called, almost overnight became both a battle cry and a badge of honor.
So sorry, I accidentally deleted the last part of this video. But anyway, I was just saying, I know it's a really long lecture, but it's a lot of information. So make sure that you were taking really good notes in preparation for exam 3. It'll be the last exam of the semester. There's no final, just the third exam. And there'll be a chapter quiz as always, and if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email or drop into office hours at 7 p.m. on Monday. So have a great week, and I'll see you in the next one.